Welcome to another episode of Innovator Insights. I'm Scott Fisher in New York, and we're skipping the tech hype to look at the messy reality of corporate AI adoption. My guest is Martin LeBlanc, Chief Experience Officer at Magnific. If you've not kept up with the platform, Magnific is a unified AI creative workspace designed for professional artists, agency creators, and enterprise marketing teams to generate, upscale, and edit visual assets at scale. The actual innovation here is that it stops treating generative models like an unpredictable guessing game, offering creative directors precise workflow orchestration and control over their final output. Guiding this evolution, and we're focusing on how teams survive this operational shift. Welcome, Martin. Thanks for being on the show. Where are you joining from?
I'm in Copenhagen, Denmark.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I want to start off by sharing with you that I created an account. I took a look around and actually used Magnific yesterday to generate an image for my newsletter this week using a prompt that I provided, and the result was very impressive. Now, obviously, Magnific can do a lot more than that. Is there anything you want to add to what I've mentioned about Magnific?
Yeah, I think, you explained it, the different groups of people who are using it, but maybe it helps talking about a little bit more concrete what you can do. So I think, mainly what I'm imagining our users, we have people in two different camps. Either they are working with marketing or they are working with film. So the marketeers, they want to create some kind of maybe eye-catching Instagram story, right? But they want to have their product in a video, for example. And usually in the past, you would have to sort of film your product, or you would have to maybe use visual effects, 3D, something like that to make something, interesting. What you can do now with AI, which is sort of becoming available for almost every team, no matter what the budget is that they can now create something that would look like a Hollywood production, right? With your product in it. There is a whole new, basically a way to be creative for companies to really communicate. You can make something way more humorous, engaging. I was just browsing X right before this podcast, and I saw a company creating a video where they were commenting on, in a funny way, on the World Cup game last night, right? So companies can now create marketing material, in a matter of hours that looks amazing. So that's sort of what this kind of generative AI is doing right now. It's just opening up for speed and creativity plus lowering the cost at the same time. So for marketeers, it's just a great tool, right? And then the other camp, the filmmakers, what we're seeing is that usually in the past we had, or also still, we have a visual effects pipeline that used to be split up into many different, very specialized roles. So one person is doing one thing. We have a large chunk of that were used to be 3D based and so on, where generative AI is sort of eating up a chunk of that workflow and just simply replacing a lot of those steps. So now you can go from, filming your actor, and then you can replace the background, change the clothing of the person, put him in, in Egypt 5,000 years ago in the matter of minutes, which would have taken a long time and many specialized roles to do. So for filmmakers, it's creating almost like a completely new workflow for visual effects.
That's very impressive. I'd imagine that you're doing that in a way that's saving these people a lot of time and money and giving them options they probably didn't have available to them previously.
Yes, I think there's definitely some money to be saved, but I don't think, at least that's what we're sensing, that many of these companies, it's not about saving money often. For example, for some of the new filmmakers, they simply approach filmmaking differently. They can basically create an early version of the film very quickly with AI and show it to an audience and then get feedback. So there's for example, the tool is not necessarily, reducing the headcount, but it can change how you work. So you can, because it's quicker to create, you can then iterate faster. And there's some, there's a lot of benefits of doing it that way. And it's sort of turning a bit of filmmaking upside down. But I think in the end, it's a positive especially for, the consumers. We're going to see, I think in film, we're going to see a lot of very creative films done by small teams over the next few years, right? So instead of only being reserved for very large teams,
large studios, right?
Yeah, we're gonna see it's sort of it's a little bit the same as you can say writers who write books. Everybody can sit down with a computer, open Word, and start writing a book. It's your talent, right? That is stopping people from doing that. And sort of like that kind of like accessibility to creation has now come to film, which is quite interesting. So what happens when you have somebody who has an amazing idea, but it's for film and not a book? I think that's going to be very interesting. We're going to see some films that are coming seamlessly out of nowhere. Maybe it's going to be on YouTube and everybody's going to be talking about it. And it was done by 2, 3, 4, 5 people.
Yeah, that's going to give a lot of startups or people just getting started who maybe don't have access to a full studio and so forth. I think it's going to give them great opportunities to compete and get their product and get their things out there for the world to see.
Yes, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
All right. So now, how do you define your mission as an innovator right now? I mean, what does your daily focus look like at Magnific?
So if on the innovation front, I think, that like two tracks. One is all the AI models that are coming out into the market. They're coming typically from American companies or Chinese companies right now. And many of these models, they are very extremely expensive to create. Like in terms of like, training data, people you need to have on your team to create those are, the best scientists in the world, and amazing talents and so on. And obviously like many companies don't have access to those people. But when these companies, they release new models, some of them are so much better that it's almost like the innovation doesn't follow a linear curve in terms of like how good they are, these models. Very often it happens more in jumps. So one example is like the world before and after ChatGPT. It was like this technology we already knew about LLMs and so on, but suddenly one became so good that now it's actually useful. And you can almost like say that date, I think it was like November 22 or something like that. It was almost like a point in time where you can say before and after.
Yeah.
And there's a really interesting graph there's a company called Stack Overflow where you can go and you can get help with coding problems. And that site was very popular. You can say that date when ChatGPT came out, you can see a downward trend, like from that exact date. So what's happening in the AI world is that very often a new technology comes out, but it's so much better that it just changes the game. It changes people's behaviors from one day to another. So as our company, it's really hard. It's really hard to predict what's going to happen in 6 months. The only thing we knew is that we need to be prepared for suddenly new technologies or AI models coming out that are radically better, and then we need to act on it very, very fast. So that means that the whole company and the whole team needs to be. We have to be extremely flexible, and we have to be ready to ditch a promising project and, jump on a new one because it has more upside. And we do make that decision, in a day max. It can be something where we just look at that technology and say, okay, that one is so promising. Don't stop doing what you're doing right now and work on that. So that's sort of like, how we're organizing the company, really trying to be so flexible that we can jump on all these new technologies and opportunities. And then I think that the other track I wanted to talk about was it's more traditional, which is basically very traditional user research. You sit down with your existing customers, you're asking about how they're working, you get insight about like their workflow, what are the pain points, you take that back to the product team, you implement those features and you iterate. That loop is like the foundation for I think any healthy product company. And in our company, the product is very, very important for our business model. We have very little IP. We don't have, the main driver for marketing is also product driven. So, if we don't execute well on the product, we're not going to survive. So that is like the foundation for everything.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important that you would have to remain agile, as you mentioned, and be able to pivot quickly and respond to the needs of the market and also specific customers as well. But all right, but let's take a look back. Over your career, you spent years building Icon Finder, right, before it was acquired by Freepik. Yep. And that platform, it dealt with static, finished vector graphics, but now you're managing fluid, generative assets. So what was the toughest part of changing your own mental framework during that transition?
I think we were like, just to also for the viewers, maybe like, so Icon Finder was like a marketplace for icons. So basically like the UI icons or something you use in presentation and so on. And Freepik was a marketplace for photos, but also had icons. And then we sort of like merged those two companies when Icon Finder got acquired. We were still working on like thinking in terms of like a marketplace where you always think about buyers and sellers, and those two parts need to sort of like be balanced. You have to, sell to the buying people, and then you give it to the providers of the graphics. You give a percentage, and then you have sort of like your own cut. So that business model is like very well defined, very well known now. And then we were still doing that. And then I remember our CEO, Joaquin, he said that he saw the first version of DALL-E, which was like one of the first image generators that gave very bad results, right? It looked horrible. But you saw sort of like, okay, DALL-E came out and then came DALL-E 2 within, I think, 6 months. But the change was dramatic. Even it was like, completely useless to something you could actually use. Like you could actually tell, okay, this is a tiger or whatever image that was. And you could just say, okay, if we are extrapolating that, it's gonna be game over for us. Like you're not gonna sell stock photos in a future where AI can generate everything, right?
Right.
So we had to completely, pivot the company, and we were 500 people at that time. So it's not like a small company. And we were even inside the company. We had like a Slack channel that was private where we talked about AI, because if we talked about AI in open channels, people would freak out. And that was like the time. It seems crazy now, but that was how it was. It was like people were generally, they thought, if you're working in a stock photo company and you see AI, everybody's going to lose their job if we don't do something. So it was like a very delicate time about like, how do we navigate that? And I think the right way we worked was that we created a team that was called Labs, and we put some of the best people there, the best product person, the best engineers, and they worked in a setting that was called Labs. There was like no expectations for them to create revenue. It was only to build basically the products that would eventually disrupt the full business, right? So that division sort of like started growing, getting more and more successful. And then at one point we had, communication to the whole team. Now we are an AI first company. We're going to phase out the old business model and focus on AI and changing all the menus, people getting new jobs. Everybody in the team got like the offer that you can change position. So if you were working on something related to stock, you can now do something else, right? And many of them were engineers or designers. You can move them around, right? So, but it was like that was sort of like the process. And it was like a combination of, some people were excited about technology. Some people were very afraid of the technology. So
that's always the case.
Or like maybe losing their job more than the technology. But it was like the unknown was very hard to navigate, I think, for employees in the beginning.
Yeah, I think as humans, your first instinct is self-preservation, right? And making sure that, how is this going to affect me? Am I going to have a job? Is there a future for me with whichever direction we're heading in? So I certainly get that, Now, the company itself made a massive move recently. You rebranded the whole thing, right? The entire enterprise ecosystem. You went from Freepik to Magnific. So what was the core strategic reasoning behind retiring such a well-known global brand name?
Yeah, so, you can't really tell that it's a mistake, because it was like serving us well for many years. But when you have a name called Freepik, it's forever tied to a price and, a type of, like, why would Freepik sell an audio tool, right? So we had that legacy, and it's perfectly fine to have that kind of name that is like very descriptive when that is what you are doing. The problem is that then when you want to pivot, you have a problem, right? So I had the same problem with Icon Finder. I also wanted to, go into illustrations and many other things, but then I had like that icon in the name, right? So I learned my lesson twice now. I'm not going to do that again. So, but we acquired the company it was actually called Magnific. It's like an upscaler technology. Very like in the industry, people really loved that one. And everybody loved the name internally inside Freepik. So we actually had the plan to rebrand for, almost like since we acquired the company, but then we didn't. It takes a lot of planning to change a company name. As you say, it's like very well known. We have 60 million users per month. So, and a lot of traffic from Google and so on. So you don't just change the domain name. We also had to acquire magnific.com. So there's and secure like all the names on every social media platform. So there's like a lot of planning needs to go in to make sure that once you change the name, you don't lose traffic, you don't lose customers, you don't, put yourself in paint yourself in the corner, right? So,
yeah, completely. I hadn't occurred to me. The names of the company was very clear and easy to understand. So yeah, it's logical that as you changed the technology and pivoted, that you would need a brand that would encompass or allow you to encompass more than you had previously and limit your previous audience, especially as you mentioned, Freepik. It didn't occur to me the word free was right in the title, and obviously you need to move away from that at some point if you want to make money, I suppose, right?
Yeah. I mean, you can make money from, we did that also in the past, even giving away stuff, you can earn money from advertising and so on. But with a new pricing model, and also, this is also like tied to some of the, like, I guess, business mechanics. So when you're selling stock images, you have files on a server, and it's very cheap to pull that image out of a database and just serve it to a customer. It costs almost like zero. So you can scale that business model. Once you have that image, you can scale it up a lot at very low cost. Whereas when you are generating using AI, every time an image is generated, it costs money. So that kind of like the freemium model that you can do on stock images, you cannot transfer that to the generative AI world, where every action the people do is attached to cash, right? To money.
It's interesting the way that works, because when you hear freemium, at least in my mind, it's like there's always a catch. Like there's always more to it. It's sometimes, I want to say this properly, like there's a bit of a negative connotation. Like, yes, this is great, but we're only going to give you so much, and then what you really need, you have to pay for. So that's a balancing act that I think as a company you probably have to work around. Providing people what they really need, or enough that they see the value in it, is to continue, I suppose, right?
Yeah. Yep.
All right. So now when a large organization, they try to implement these new generative systems, the underlying technology, that's not generally where the problem is or where the bottleneck is. So where do you see the structural friction happening when you get a traditional creative group that tries to move their daily habits? How do you where do you see that friction taking place?
Yeah, so I think this is probably true for all companies affected by generative AI. Let's say you have a team maybe of copywriters, so 5 copywriters in a team and 1 manager, and you suddenly one of these copywriters find out that they can do the work of 5 people with AI, right? You kind of like get this dynamic where people don't want to lose their colleagues. They don't want to be the only one left in the company sitting with AI. So there's kind of like this a very human dimension where there's a resistance to doing something radically different.
Yeah.
Because people don't want that kind of like dynamic where I'm responsible for my colleague losing his job. So and this, I wouldn't say that this is happening like a very large scale, but we're definitely seeing some of this kind of like patterns where when workflows change, when people can suddenly design using Claude and you're working with the designer, then the designer doesn't feel great because he wants to do stuff manually, but then the other person can do it, using Claude or whatever. So you have these kind of like very difficult situations. And the way we found that sort of like unlocks that is almost similar to what I talked about with labs. Is like you need to sort of like split, maybe take some people from the organization that are very enthusiastic about AI, put them in a new team and tell them you're going to be working in the new way, like AI first. So there's like nobody will lose their job when they're exploring AI, but you're just in the company, you're sort of like figuring out a smarter way to work. And once you figured that out, you can then take the rest of the company on the journey. So you sort of like, you don't have the resistance, like a little bit of the time, you kind of like prove it in a setting. And then it's like, up to management to say, okay, we believe this is a new way to work. And then you sort of like adopt that at once in the whole company. That's sort of like the process we've seen work better.
I know you've spoken out, you have like strong conviction that true creativity belongs strictly to humans, even when you build software that automates production pipelines. So is there a specific creative task that companies are trying to automate right now that you think they should just like completely leave alone and not touch?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's like something, pretty fundamental to humans where we think that creativity is is unique to humans, and I don't think so. Actually, I think there's like creativity is sort of like a process that, because it's very, it's often happening in our subconscious mind and so on. We don't have like the full visibility about like what's actually happening, but in the end, it's a combination of combining known concepts in new ways, and computers can actually do that. So it's not completely, I think what is like what I would not. I think that's like what's happening right now is that also we're talking about in the beginning, like marketeers and everybody has suddenly access to all these visual effects options and so on. What's happening now is just that when everybody gets the same, tools, the competition doesn't get easier. It's like, the bar just changes, and then everything just becomes like, the ads or whatever you're seeing on Instagram just becomes better. And then the question again becomes, how do you stand out? Like what is going to be the thing that is going to be different about you than your competitor with the same tools? And then the question is like, or the answer is basically coming back to the person who's using those tools. The person who's guiding the tools is going to be the differentiating factor, right? So, but maybe the thing is no longer just the creation process. It's not like about, can I actually draw this or can I actually create this? It's more about, because it's very easy to create now. So it becomes, when I'm creating, what I'm asking for, and when I'm seeing something, what am I throwing away and what am I keeping? Sort of like taste, right? So that's sort of like probably the human element now is like, what are you gonna ask those tools for? And when it gives you a response, when are you happy about it? And that's gonna be sort of like the main thing that we will sort of like be competing for. We will see that there are people who are extremely good at that, and every company wants to hire those guys. It's not going to make it easier for everyone, but the skills in demand is going to change.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I know that, from what I've read, you produce electronic music, right? So that requires an incredibly slow and meticulous track editing. But how does that slow creative discipline change how you think about building what would be considered, fast, real-time software?
Yeah, so I think, there's like a lot when you're creating music, it's about getting into like a flow state where, get your brain to get ideas and then almost immediately get them out. Like you're sitting with a piano or whatever and you're coming up with melodies. The first half an hour, nothing good comes out, but you just keep pushing. And then eventually you start like getting into a flow where your mood of the day or whatever suddenly becomes a song. And if you come back to the piano the day after, you cannot get into that flow again. It's almost like that little idea or inspiration is very, is very fragile and very short-lived. And I think, this is probably true for most creative work. What is interesting is actually, I think when working with these AI tools, you can actually get into the same kind of like flow state where you sit and you come up with ideas and so maybe instead of like playing a piano, you're writing prompts, but you can still get into a state where you're suddenly like getting inspiration by your own work, and the great content suddenly just produces itself because you're just in this flow state where you're writing prompts, looking at the results, you're having a good time, you're sort of like, yep, this is it. And then suddenly you have a video and you've got to be like, this is amazing. If you stopped halfway in that production process and you try to go back to it the day after, you wouldn't have the same inspiration. And it's very similar, I found, whether you're making it manually with, synthesizers or whatever, or you're sitting with these tools. I think what's true for both those processes is that if you don't really master the tools, you cannot get to that state. You sort of like have to get into a state where everything you want to do is so easy that you don't think about the actual doing. It's more about like executing on the ideas.
Yeah, but now you contrast that with the other aspect of your life that I understand is running long distances, right? So that requires real steady pace and heavy endurance. Now, how does that long distance mindset keep you grounded when the whole tech market is demanding, this relentless sprint?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's like, if you try to sprint all the time, as a company, you're going to burn out. So that's a lot of entrepreneurs. It's like, or starting companies is much more marathon than sprints, for sure. And you need to have a high pace. You need to win the race, right? So
Right.
you don't win a marathon by sprinting, because then you're gonna get like 5 kilometers in and then you're gonna walk, right? So it's all about figuring out when to go fast and when to go slow, but have have a pace that you and your team can keep up, over the long run. And sometimes you need to sprint. You need to have like, if there's like a
Interesting.
new technology coming out, then it's like you have to work fast, right?
But that's the value you bring to an organization, right? I would assume your ability to recognize when you need to take it a little bit slower and when you really need to be responsive and sprint. That's
I think
what you do.
I think anybody who has leadership positions, no matter if it's a small company or large company, figuring out like when do you ask people to run and when to slow down, that is like crucial. You need to excite people. We have this conference, we have this deadline, we have this opportunity, get people excited, run really fast. And then afterwards you celebrate, take it slow, recharge, and then you do it again. I mean, that's a very fundamental, I think, great principle to work by as a manager.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes though, it's also, it's challenging as a manager to encourage people to work quickly, meet a deadline, you have a big project and so forth. But I think sometimes it can be equally hard when in your mind you have a clear vision for why you don't want them to be working so quickly on a specific task at this time, to get them to slow down when they're used to a breakneck speed. So in your mind, it doesn't, the best approach isn't for them to be working quickly right now. You want them to take their time, go slow, and for whatever reasons that perhaps you can't share with them, to get them to slow down a little bit. They're all of a sudden like, wait a minute, you're always telling us move. So I think that's the manager's job, is to be able to get people to work at the appropriate pace at the appropriate time. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. Let's go back to talking about the product itself. Magnific. It's model agnostic, so it lets creative teams swap out different back-end video and image engines, right? So depending on their project and so forth. Now, how do you keep that user experience seamless when the underlying engines behave completely differently?
Yeah. So one thing we try to do is that we have image models. We have 40 different image models. All of the image models, they have some similarities. They all accept like a prompt, but then some of them can take like reference images. So if you have a product or person or a color scheme or whatever, you can provide that also. But what we do is that we basically let people choose. We have an auto mode. So if you don't know which model you want to use, you can always choose that. And then depending on what you write in the prompt, we will pick the model for you. But if you know which one you want, we basically just like modify the UI just a little bit, so we are matching whatever that model can use and take. But otherwise, we really try very hard, no matter if it's video generation, audio, or images, 3D. We try to keep the UI as consistent as possible, so you have sort of like that familiarity of, okay, this is the prompt box. It always looks the same. It always sits in the same place, right? And then you get these kind of like UI principles, so it makes it easy for people to jump between tools and models. And in the end, the name of the model is just a name, and that you click, and you don't have to sort of like necessarily change how you work. Some of the good, like the more pro users, they learn which models are good for what, and then they switch between them. So they use the strengths and weaknesses of the different models.
Yeah, I think it's important. You pointed out the interface. People get used to seeing a slider here or, some sort of button here. You don't want to change that radically on them. But sometimes you have to, I suppose, right? If it improves the product or there's a specific reason. So you just have to get the end user. I guess you bring them along slowly. How does that work? Like, you don't want to introduce something radically different, but yet that from a productivity point of view, you need to make a change. So how do you do that not to interrupt what the workflow that they're used to?
So one thing we have a principle for the product, which is basically that when you're sort of like starting out with the product or using one of the tools we have on the website, is that the UI needs to be very simple. So you can use the tools without having a tutorial. You don't need to like read anything. You can just go and start. But on the other hand, we also have professional users. So what you often see is that the UI at first is very simple, but there's always a lot of things hidden under like maybe advanced settings, a settings icon, and so on. And if you start clicking those buttons and you open up the UI, you'll see that you have a way more tool and like handles to pull and so on. So we try to build tools that are very easy for people to get started with, but on the other hand, also gives the the people who know what they're doing, they have all the options available. So that's sort of like a fine balance to figure out like where do you make that cut. But we want to make sure that we are not hiding the necessarily like the complexity. It's there. You have to click. So beginners, they don't get distracted by it, but the ones who want it, they can always get it.
Yeah, that's really important. I mean, I mentioned to you that I went onto the site myself, and it was very important to me, having never, used it before, that in a very short amount of time, I was able to do a very simple task. And again, I know your product is not designed solely for the type of use that I used it for. Just, create an image for me. I can do that in, any other AI tool. But it was great that I was able to go in, see an interface that I'd never seen before, and figure out how to navigate my way around. And I'm sure, as you mentioned, if I wanted to dig deeper, because I did have a skill set that required more tools from your product, I could find them. But it was nice that the interface wasn't intimidating. It didn't overwhelm me when I first went into it. It's got some common characteristics of other tools that I may have used before, but yet there's some very unique aspects to your tool that make it, in my mind, it stood out right away. So that was a great experience for me as well. And as we talk about that, that's important. You have like over 1 million paid subscribers, right? So if you're going to make some changes or you're going to do some things, it could really make it difficult for someone who's got a saved setup. So when you make those changes, how do you consider that? You don't want to accidentally disrupt what they've been working on for months.
Yeah. So if you're like referring to how do we change the UI without like alienating existing users and so on,
especially someone, sorry to interrupt, but especially someone who's literally mid-project. Like, I've been working on this thing, and now today I come in and everything looks different.
Yeah. That is like really, that's a big problem for companies that really start, like, because we have many companies now that are really relying on the UI and the processes for very streamlined work and so on. And some of them also create internal courses or internal documentation about how to use the platform. So if we move a button, their internal education and so on gets outdated, right? So it's a very delicate task to actually change the UI. What we normally do is that we release new versions and then we put them under, like, we call them feature flags. And then we can go in and we can, for example, release a new version of the product to a specific country. We can go and say, okay, everybody in UK gets access to the product. We then track, like, how are these users interacting? Are they generating more images or downloading more? Like, figure out some like metric that indicates that the product has improved. And then only when we have that both in qualitative data, like, user testing, seeing people use it, get feedback, while also seeing that maybe for a specific country, we can now see positive KPIs, then we roll it out. So, and then on top of that, we also we have educational materials. So we're making, tutorials on YouTube with, every tool we have like a video that 5 minutes or whatever that goes through that tool. And then we try to keep them updated. So as soon as we have a new version of the product, that's the important part,
right? So it's keeping them updated, because I think that's very important, is keeping them updated, because it frustrates the heck out of me if I'm looking at a video of a version of something that doesn't exist anymore and I can't go and follow and match it up. Let me ask you, your experiences, are the video tutorials or the written tutorials, which one do you think your users are looking for more? Can you check?
Video, for sure.
Yeah.
Video.
Okay.
Yeah. I think video tutorials, if done right, are way more pleasant for people. There are some situations, especially, let's say, if you're asking people to, for our UI, we have sort of like, we're using the full screen and we have buttons everywhere and so on. If you try to put that into writing, you would have, text saying, bottom right corner, click this button and so on. And the tutorial will become very painful to read, because you have to sort of like read a sentence and look at the screen. If you have a video, what we do is that we just have a screen recording and then we put a voiceover over it. So you actually see the product there in the video, the mouse moving around, and a person talking to you, right? So that is a lot more pleasant to learn that way. And a lot of the things that we're generating on the platform is also visual, right? So we can show a tutorial and say, in this tutorial, you will learn to make this video. Bam, we show the video. and then we teach how to do it, right? So I think, just the nature of the product, the nature of the UI and everything, video tutorials just works way better. But there are some cases where you need like steps, like, just written down. And so we have a help center where we have, things written down. And then we have Academy, which is video tutorials.
Yeah, it's a balance, I suppose, that every company runs into, is what's the best way to provide the support resources that people need. And some people work better, in different mediums. So it's important. But I think overall, I would agree with you. The videos are probably the most important, the most practical, the most efficient way or effective way to do it. But again, I think it's critical that you don't end up with a library of videos that don't reflect your current product line, because that's disappointing as a customer when you see somebody. I find that more so when I'm reading something online, or if I've used one of the chatbots to search for something, it's given me specific instructions to do something, but they don't match the model phone I'm on or the software that's been updated, and it doesn't follow exactly. So I find that frustrating. But all right, anyway, so let's finish up here with a final practical takeaway, if you don't mind. So if you're a creative director and you're sitting in an agency tomorrow morning, you're surrounded by old operating structures, what's the very first organizational adjustment you should make?
Okay, so if you are working without generative AI, I would definitely figure out who in the team has the most enthusiasm about generative AI. Release them from necessarily not necessarily like daily tasks, but don't measure necessarily their performance for a while they explore how can we work differently and sort of work smarter, faster, better results, but using generative AI. And once you figure that out, you can then say, okay, let's take some of the best ideas here and then implement them, in the whole team. So, but doing this split and I think trying to mix too much generative AI with traditional workflows can be a very difficult mix sometimes. And also, I think it's also very important to tell people that it's perfectly fine to use generative AI. It's not cheating, right? Some people are afraid that, I wrote this text, but I used, ChatGPT. Is that okay? Do I need to hide it or is it okay, right? And then you need to talk to people about it. In the end, it's really about the end result. I mean, if you're writing a text with ChatGPT and the text is bad, you're not doing your job, right? So think a lot about people need to be using the tools, but they definitely need to have that kind of filter where they don't just copy paste whatever ChatGPT gives you. It's like we still need great copywriting. Actually, we expect better copywriting now when you have these tools, right? So figure out how to use the tools so you don't make the copywriting worse, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to good prompt writing, right? Which I think is a very critical skill that hopefully the schools are going to start focusing on that a little bit more as they start focusing on the newer technology. But I think the final result also is, the human editor at the end. It can't just be copy paste and go with it. First of all, you don't know if it's reliable, but second of all, like you said, it needs to be personalized. It needs to meet the exact need that you're looking for. So the only way that's going to happen, I think, is with the human that works in your organization, that understands your organization, understands the project and the task, and can make it meet the company's needs. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. Martin, I thank you so much for coming on and sharing a look behind the scenes. For everyone listening or watching right now, be sure to check out magnific.com. Please hit the follow or subscribe button directly inside the app you're listening to right now. And if you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the channel, click the thumbs up, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a conversation. Be sure to drop a comment below with your thoughts on the conversation today. And a huge thank you to the content team at GAT Labs, our sponsor, for making this conversation possible. If you catch up on the other episodes and find out more about the show at innovatorinsights.io. Thank you so much. I'm Scott Fisher. Make it a great day. Martin, appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Scott.